Good evening, everybody. We're going to have a good discussion tonight between myself and Mr. Greg Rogers
Rogers.
here. We've discussed some things before in the past, and so we're kind of doing it again just to have a nice little conversation. How's it going, man?
It's going well, doing real well.
Good, man. How was your New Year's?
It was good. We hung out and basically watched football. You know what
Oh,
most of us were doing around here in Texas.
right.
So yeah, we were enjoying that and got together with family. So that was good. I'm sure a lot of
Cool.
people did that. Yeah.
Okay. Cool,
So
man.
it's good.
Well, just to get straight into it, tell the audience a little bit about who you are and your position. Anything you want to advertise on the channel. I don't have many subscribers or viewers. This is mainly just to have a conversation among friends
No
and
worries.
everything. But feel
No,
free.
no worries. Yeah. Obviously, Greg Rogers. I'm actually I'm an artist. I'm also an author, and I also am working on some things towards global revival as a Christian, writing a global strategy for how does that take place, what kind of ministries can pull together and actually work as one, try to act like the body of Christ as opposed to a bunch of body parts running around and running into each other every once in a while and saying we're
Hmm.
working together. So
Hmm.
the book that I wrote, one called Created, The Devil's Apprentice. It's the first in a 5-book, maybe 6-book series. It's actually being talked about right now by the folks that produced the Chronicles of Narnia movies and are talking
Hmm.
about turning it into its own movie series and maybe kind of making it into its own kind of Marvel universe, possibly, kind of a thing. So,
Cool.
yeah, it's Created, The Devil's Apprentice is basically a book that I spent about 3 years thinking about one question, which was, why would an omniscient God who's perfect in every way create anything that has a will of its own, starting with the angels? And then I've written a subsequent book it's going through the editorial process called Created Heaven and Earth, or Heavens and
Hmm.
Earth, which is about the first 5 days of creation. And I'm working on the third one right now, which is Created Image Bearers, talking about the creation of man. So I thought it would be, when I heard, Scott, you mentioned that you wanted to talk about creation and all of
Hmm.
that, I thought it would be an interesting topic because I've
Hmm.
given it about well over a decade of thought here
Great. I'm sure you
and
can
trying to
inform
dig
us
down to
all,
it.
man, on some views. I mean, I'd like to say I've heard it all. I used to be a very zealous sort of Christian early on as a young man, and did a lot of proselytizing, a
Hmm.
lot of Bible study, a lot of teaching, or trying to help people to Christ and trying to help people find their way to God. Took it very serious. However, I'm now more of a naturalist. Like, you could say, I act or behave as an atheist in a way because I
Hmm.
don't see this. I don't view the God, if you want to call it that. If we're going to talk about God in that context, I
Yeah.
would just appeal to the nature of reality, which
Yeah.
is really vague and really doesn't work for a lot of people. And I admit it's not a scientific argument or anything like that. It's more of an expression of awe of the universe, of science, of the process. But I also understand evil exists,
Hmm.
terrible things happen, people suffer almost needlessly, if not a lot
Hmm.
needlessly.
Hmm.
And so this sort of view sort of ties all those things together. I can have a little bit of both without facing the problems of evil and some of the other philosophical, you know, issues and problems that seem to be unanswered for the last thousands of so years,
Yeah.
divine hiddenness, things of that nature. So, yeah, I'm sort of a naturalist. Um, and, I understand Christianity. I like to say I do. I
Right.
know a lot of people have different interpretations and understandings, like the nature of God, the nature of Christ, the nature of salvation, what will save a person's soul.
Hmm.
Is it works? Is it faith? Is it a little bit of both? What does that mean? The Trinity, is God, um, three beings or three persons in one being? Um, these sort of questions. I think I understand a lot of these arguments, but you never know. So I enjoy
Right.
talking about the conversation, and opposed to what people believe. So I'm not one of these angry atheists that wants to change people's minds. I encourage you, if Christianity or Islam or Hinduism or Buddhism or whatever it is that helps you in your life to be a better person, that's more of what I'm interested in. Is I'm less interested in about beliefs than I am in what you do for the world.
Mm,
The other side, we have arguments.
yeah.
So I argue with atheists, I argue with people of all different religions, not argue, but just talk about things and sort of do epistemology with people
Yeah.
just to find out, how do you connect the dots? How do
Right.
you make sense of the claims that you make, if you're making any at all?
Yes.
And I'm just very interested in thought process.
Yeah.
And I think these things are important in a way, because I think that the quality of how we think and how we reason can inform decisions in the world to make society better, culture better.
Yeah.
So I don't mind going over things like this. And hopefully, I ask tough questions. Hopefully, I'm entertaining the people out here so they don't tune out, and
Yeah.
we can get a little bit spicy with the conversation. Don't take it personal. It's just conversation, and believe what you will. Let's just discover how we come to those conclusions.
You bet.
Sure. So I guess just to be um, show a little politeness, I'll let you go first. What is your belief about the origins of life?
Right. Well, I'm, I'm,
Huge question.
I'm a Christian. I'm a
Yeah.
Christian. So I
Hmm.
do go back to the Bible and
Hmm.
look at that. But I will say that I probably, let me say this. I think I've probably grown more in my Christian faith over the last 10 years by speaking with atheists, Muslims, and others outside of the church than I have been speaking with people inside the church, just because of what you just described with the challenging questions and bringing those and having to really critically think about, okay, why do I believe what I believe, and kind of dig down into those things. I probably would have been described 10 years ago as a young earth creationist, and probably would live and die on 6 days. 6,000 years ago, all the things that you would normally say. Here's what an evangelical fundamental Christian would say. I still believe I'm still a fundamental Christian, but I would say that I actually don't think that those questions matter that much. That at the end of the day, none of us were there, and all of us are presenting what we believe,
Hmm.
and yet we probably can't, any of us really decipher all the way down through all the data that exists and actually say that we know with 100% certainty this is exactly how it happened. I think at the end of the day, we're probably all going to end up being a little bit surprised if there's an afterlife in which we're able to think about such matters, and if not, we won't think about them anyway, and it won't matter at that point at all. So I would say, as a creationist, I believe, though, that when it says in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, that God was the one that did that. And if you ask me about the origin of life, I think it happens when God says, and the Spirit hovered over the surface of the waters. And when he did that, that was when probably the building blocks of life first began. If you were a naturalist, you might believe it was probably something happening in a hydrothermal vent, where it was superheating something that was not alive and gave it the element of life, or it was a primordial soup and it got hit by lightning and somehow, or some kind of energy source, and by that the building blocks of life came into being. I think that power source was the Holy Spirit.
Mm.
Um, and so if you were to ask and say, okay, if I'm talking about abiogenesis, I think there is abiogenesis, but I think it happens by virtue of the Holy Spirit actually moving on that which is lifeless and making it alive.
Mm. Okay.
So, yeah.
And so, if I understand you correctly, so these processes were sort of started by the Holy Spirit or God's power
Yes.
or some part of who God's nature, I suppose. How can we test? Well, first of all, let me ask you this. It sounds like you do value the scientific method. Is that correct or no?
Absolutely. And in fact, I actually think that the evidence that most atheists are looking for to say, and I don't think we can ever 100% prove the existence of God, but if you
Mhm,
were trying to wrap it down and say, how do I look at my confidence intervals? How do I look at that and say the statistical probability is higher?
mhm,
I think it's actually the sciences that lead us that way. And maybe some of the evidence is that when an atheist says, if God would just show me something, it may be actually what you believe, you see and
mm,
observe is actually the evidence that he's given, such as
mm,
evolution, such
mm,
as like I said, abiogenesis, and I obviously I'm pointing to a different power source, but I'm saying there was something
mm,
that transpired there, and it may be just that an atheist or a naturalist has not gotten convinced yet of that power source, but
mhm.
we would agree on the mechanisms and process.
Okay, okay. So, so there's two things I think we can draw from that. One is being that you can sort of say, well, there's got to be some sort of cause to
Yes.
the process, right?
Yeah.
And then on a
I don't think we
Christian
have
world,
infinite regress of
right?
causation.
Okay,
I don't
okay.
think that, because I think by definition, if anything exists then that was created, if there
Hmm.
was something that had a beginning, that if you go in infinite regression and of causation, you would never have anything that would come into being. There would have to be a uncaused first cause.
Hmm.
And then the question
Hmm.
is whether or not that uncaused first cause is actually personal or not.
Hmm.
And that's
Hmm.
probably where we would diverge
Possibly. You see,
potentially.
yeah, potentially, because for me, I'm sort of agnostic about a lot of things.
Okay.
So, and that's just out of my own personal, um, you know, humbleness, I guess, or
Yeah.
I don't want to make a claim that I can't really back up and
I
just
would probably be called an agnostic theist a bit,
gotcha, gotcha. I
because I would
understand.
actually say, although I have a certain level of confidence,
Hmm.
I can't say with all certainty this. I won't know until I die whether or not there really is a God. Although I
Good for you,
believe
man.
with a huge amount of confidence, because of I believe the relationship that I sense and believe is taking place, that there is a God that I'm communing with,
Hmm.
and that I do have that relationship. Uh, but because I don't see him face to face, I
Hmm.
I don't see him in that way. So I would say I believe, but I don't know.
Gotcha. And it may be a little bit off topic, but it's just
Yeah,
the questions are just beaming in my mind right now. So I'm thinking, so how under that you kind of lean towards an intelligent creator behind it, someone who are there any other properties of this creator that you sort of assume should be the case, or that you lean towards, like, is this a loving sort of God? Does he have a personality?
I think
Is he
his
omniscient? Like, there's
yeah,
these.
yeah. I would say probably at his core he's perfect, perfectly
Hmm.
holy, perfectly righteous. Which obviously begs the question: what does it mean to be perfect? We can go down that discussion, obviously, because
Hmm.
perfect's a term that how do you define perfect? Um,
Hmm.
I
Complete,
believe he's
maybe. Can we say like complete, like an entire circle? When I was a Christian, that was how we defined perfection, was
yeah.
completeness.
I think perfect is defined in terms of his essence.
Hmm.
And it's if it's righteous, it's perfect in that righteousness. If it's unrighteous, he's perfectly not that thing. And so uh, and I believe that ultimately what ends up happening is perfection is defined by the nature of his own essence. He is the standard of that. And so whether or not we may look at him and say, I think you're perfect, because he's the standard and he's the sustainer and giver of life, he's really the only standard that matters.
Hmm. Okay.
And so he's the standard of consequence on what is
Gotcha.
perfect. Yeah.
Gotcha. So this perfection sort of lays within his nature or his essence. And essence is another weird word I've always struggled with. What does essence mean to you?
Uh, it's a great question, because it's his core attributes, his it's um, it's the unique nature of who he is, as opposed to his identity.
Hmm.
Um, it's you mentioned something in the introduction around the Trinity, and I think that really comes into bearing when you talk about essence. Have you ever, the word, the name of God is Yahweh, right?
Hmm.
The Hebrew name
Yep.
is Yahweh, which means I am that I am, or I am what I am.
Hmm.
And I think what God is actually expressing there is a law of logic that applies only to himself, which is that his identity is equal to his essence.
Hmm.
That when he says he's perfect love, he is perfect love, and that is his identity. He
Hmm.
is perfect holiness. He is perfect justness. He is perfect. He is everything that is the purest form of that thing, um,
Hmm.
as is defined by the pureness of himself. Uh,
Are you saying, is God sort of like a ideal, like a platonic ideal that,
no, he's a
this
personal.
is, so he's a
He's a
personal,
personage.
okay.
Yeah,
So,
he is an identity whose identity actually is his essence as well. You can't
okay.
separate the two.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And your confidence level, just to kind of get a feel for where you're at, how far do you lean? I know you're an agnostic theist, but I suppose it's over 50%
Probably
that
like
you believe this.
99%.
99%. Okay.
But
And wow,
unless I
what
can
get
get to 100%, I can't say that I know. I
hmm
can say that I believe.
okay.
Uh, and even that, I'm sure someone will be able to demonstrate, hey, wait a minute, there are things that you don't know, even more so than what you think you know.
Hmm.
And I'm good with that.
Hmm.
I think there's an infinite amount of stuff that I don't know.
Gotcha. Yeah, because a lot of people view knowledge as like an on-off switch. Like you either know something or you don't know it at all.
Right.
And if you're at 99%, we can't trust anything you've got to say because
I, I've
you're
I've
just
had
being
some
arbitrary.
I've had some folks, even the church that I belong to, that have said, "How can you tell someone that you don't know?" Because
Mhm.
the Bible says, "I've written these things in that order that you might know that you have salvation, and that we know Him by a personal relationship that we have with Him." And it's just that I'm good. I'm good with the fact that, wait a minute, it's okay to be in a nebulous place.
Mhm.
Most people feel like they have to have complete control, and
Mhm.
I just have gotten past that.
Gotcha.
It's okay not to know everything.
That's great. So we talk about the essence and nature um, of God. Does God need anything? Would you
No,
say he doesn't need anything?
he
So let
doesn't
me
need
ask you
anything.
this question. We're talking about the origins of life.
Yeah,
Why did God create life?
yeah. You remember me saying I I wrote a book and I talked about why would
Hmm.
an omniscient God create anything that has a will of its own.
Right.
I think he doesn't need anything, first of all, and
Hmm.
so he doesn't need anything that has a will of its own. I say that in one breath, and then I'll say that I think the answer to that question is that he actually was compelled to create it. So, there was an internal want that God had, and because of his own nature being perfect, that internal want actually became a need,
Mm.
and that is the whole reason why God created anything. But the reason why he created anything that doesn't have a will is not because of himself. He doesn't have a need to be more creative or to demonstrate his creativity. He's perfectly content in and of himself if he's perfect in all ways. So if he's
Hmm.
perfectly content, he doesn't need to create anything. The reason why he would create those things is actually because he created other things that have a will, and those things actually have need of these things in order for them to survive.
Hmm.
And so
Hmm.
I think the first thing he created was actually probably the higher heavens. And
Hmm.
he created the higher heavens not because he needed a place to live, because he's omnipresent. I think he created it because the angels needed a place to be.
Hmm.
And so then everything else falls out of that.
Falls right out of that. Hmm. Okay. So
So you really do have to
God,
start with, why would God create anything that has a will of its own?
yeah, and it seems like, I mean, and talking about these things, Christians are different.
Yes.
Um, we talk about how, in the creation story, the fall
Yes.
and the punishment, the rewards, the punishment, all of these things. Um, God does in your view, does God hate sin, or what is your view? Did God want sin, or did God want
Yeah.
man to fall? Was that part of his plan?
Great question. I don't think you can understand the fall of man until you understand the fall of the angels, because I don't think that
Hmm.
the fall of man is the driving force of everything.
Hmm.
And I don't think this is about good and bad. I don't think this is about evil and good. I think it's about perfect and imperfect. And and so I think what you end up is, yeah, does God hate evil? Um, he he is incompatible with evil. He is incompatible with anything that is not perfectly aligned with his essence.
Hmm.
So that means there's not a single thing that you or I do that is compatible with his essence.
Okay.
Because if unless, like, even my love of my wife, do I
Hmm.
love her perfectly, unconditionally, at all times, every time? No, I screw up. So
Hmm.
my love is not perfect love. So even the best thing that I do is actually falls short of the glory of God. And
Hmm.
therefore, I would say that there's not probably an action that we do or anything about us that actually is compatible with him post the fall.
Okay. So, many people would argue that this sort of brings a contradiction
Yep.
based on the omni qualities of this God. So, if he's all powerful, all loving, all knowing,
Yeah.
it creates a few dilemmas out here that we can go over.
Love it.
Um, so we've got an all knowing God, right? In your view,
Yep.
did God know beforehand everything that was going to happen? Or is he just kind of learning and is kind of surprised as time goes on?
No, he's known everything before
It's known.
anything.
Okay.
He's known it all.
So now we have this issue,
How can he be perfectly
foreknowledge.
loving?
Well, just within this one little topic here of
Yeah.
all knowing. So we have this situation of divine foreknowledge
Yes.
and the problem of evil,
Yes.
right? So we've got evil in the world. He knew all of this was going to happen.
Yeah.
Now, do you believe in conscious torment, like hell, fire, and brimstone and things
I
of that
do.
nature? Okay. So God knew that at least one human being is going to suffer,
Yes.
or one angel and one human at least is
Yes.
going to suffer forever and ever and ever and ever in hell,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
How do you square that with the all-loving, all-knowing God
Well,
that created?
I think there's no way to square it unless you say that he's compelled to do it.
Mm,
If he's choosing it, like if you're like Calvinism, would say, hey, he created certain ones unto the purpose of them actually going to hell. Why? Because it demonstrates some other aspects of his nature, and you can't really prove love unless you have the possibility of something else. I disagree with that. If you're saying that, you're basically taking someone on the basis of saying that they're completely sovereign. You want them to
mhm,
be a completely sovereign God, and you're taking away their perfect love and perfect compassion. If any of your answer ends up in a place where you have left some aspect of God imperfect, I would say that your answer is incomplete or is wrong.
mhm,
And so that takes you back to your question where you just asked me, okay, wait a minute, how in the world could there be a perfectly loving God if you did this? And that's where I think you have to start with the angels, because he started by creating the angels. I think man is a few steps down the line,
mhm.
and is actually a response to an accusation that was made by one of the angels who had fallen.
And he knew all this was going to happen
I
from
think
the
he knew all
beginning.
this was going to happen from the beginning, and the reason why he's compelled to do it is because You know how the Bible, I don't know if you know this, but the Bible says that God inhabits the praises of Israel. Have
Mm-hmm.
you read that
Mm-hmm.
verse? So he inhabits the praises or the worship that's offered to him by a being that has a will of its own identity and ability to choose to worship him.
Mm-hmm.
And he says that he can inhabit that place. It means that his omnipresence is only complete if this thing that he creates, actually he creates it to exist so that he could experience himself within that place. That place would never exist unless that being was created.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think where you start off is that God has he's perfectly content in and of himself, so he doesn't need any of that stuff, but yet he did it, and you have to ask why.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's because he knew that the three personages of the Trinity could inhabit that place and experientially know themselves in a way that they could only know as head knowledge, not experiential knowledge, unless they did actually create that place. So if you're a perfect God and you know that you're the greatest treasure of all, if you could know yourself experientially in a way that you couldn't know unless you created that, what would
Mm-hmm.
happen to you if you chose not to create that place?
Well, you wouldn't know. I would think that, if you don't have the experience, you're not really going to have that kind of knowledge, right? Is that what you're getting at, if I
Well,
understand
you
you?
would know that you could know yourself better, but you
Mm-hmm.
don't know yourself as well as you
Mm-hmm.
could know yourself. And if you're the greatest treasure that there is it?
Mm-hmm.
I think all of us would probably get to the point, if I could have the greatest treasure of all, but now I don't have it, and I have the possibility of it, is there a chance that you would become discontent?
Yeah, of course.
So is there a chance that God, knowing that he could know himself, could actually become discontent? And
It
at what point
seems
does
like it. If this God would be anything like us in that sense, yeah,
so
that
if
makes
he
total sense.
okay, so if he could become discontent, at what point does discontentment become imperfection?
Right. Well, it seems like it's already there. It's
Yeah.
already kind of potentially
And
there.
and so God's in the place, I think, is finds himself in a place where he can look and say, wait, if I don't create the angels to worship me, then I will end up in a place where I myself will become the very thing that I can't stand. I would live for eternity in my own living hell. So then does he become a selfish God? Because now he's creating the angels, right? To
Hmm.
fulfill this need, so that because it is now a need, it's not a want, because he needs it, or he will have to live with himself in his own version of hell.
Hmm.
So does he become a selfish God? Yes, unless he creates a way out for everything that he creates that would give him a chance. So he gives
Hmm.
everything its own will, its own chance to be able to determine whether or not it will choose to do what he says, in accordance with his good, perfect, and pleasing will, or to go the way of their own will. So they have a choice, a chance to not choose to go outside of his will.
Hmm. Hmm. So all of this sort of symmetry that you're
Mhm.
kind of pointing to, sort of unfolds through time and history and events and things. Is that what is this?
But
Is this
because
kind of
God,
what?
yeah, it unfolds in events and things like that for us. For him, because he's transcendent of time, he actually knows it before the very beginning.
Hmm.
And that's why the Bible says, before the foundations of the earth were laid, Christ was crucified. If you want to know what God looks through to be able, because if he's transcendent, he would see every moment as being now. So he would, even if he had a solution, he would also live all those other moments where the solution wasn't in existence, as if he was living in that moment. The
Hmm.
only way that he could actually be able to look at anything and be involved with it would be that he would have to look through the solution.
Okay.
And so it's actually that Christ, God, God looks through the risen Savior. He always sees everything through a resurrected Jesus.
Mm. So it's like God let me ask you this question. Could God have done it differently and achieve the same purpose? Why did it have to entail the suffering and the sin and the hellfire for the unbelievers and things of that nature? Is it possible that God could have created a universe where none of those things were actually needed, and yet he achieved perfection and everything that you're kind of driving at with his nature and his goals and things of that nature.
Obviously, because that then leads into, is he omnipotent? Could he have created a different place? I think the answer is yes and no. Could he have created it? Yes, he is capable of creating anything, but not in the presence of truly giving free will.
Mm-hmm.
When you truly give free will, even though he could force a pathway, it would actually eliminate free will. And if it eliminates free will, it eliminates worship. If it eliminates worship, he's back in the same ballpark that he was before. So is he truly omnipotent? Yes, he has the power to do it. And no, he doesn't have the power to do it if he's going to actually offer free will,
Well,
which
yeah,
is
there'd be a
necessary in order to.
contradiction.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Now there's also a little tension between free will and omniscience and all of this as well, right? So if he's
Yeah.
seeing all of these things that are going to happen, could he have chosen differently, or could we humans have chosen to do different? If he's seen that, before I
Yeah.
die, I'm going to do everything that I'm going to that's going to unfold in my lifetime,
Right.
right?
What God
Do
knows is the final decision of someone's will. What your free will is when I get to the point where even if I could choose differently, I won't choose differently. That is what he knows to be your will. Is that
Mhm.
place where you have openly made the decision that even if I could choose a different path, I am never going to choose that path. And so when what is dictated is actually what you have already decided as being the final solution.
Now
So he knows that. Yeah.
these decisions we make, um, it seems like we make decisions within a context of
Yes.
possibilities and a menu. So I couldn't help but be born in the time I was born, wear the clothes that I wear, speak the language that I speak. And
Hmm.
all of my decisions are sort of based on that, as well as genetic factors, so many
Yeah.
different things. Um, they were out deeply influenced. So are you so with the sort of free will that you were talking about, is this sort of like a compatibilist sort of free will? It sounds like you've got this compatibilist thing going, or is this, or are you still
When you say compatibilist, tell me what that means, because I'm not a philosopher.
yeah,
I'm just
so
a
a
guy who thinks.
compatibilist would say, you're kind of stuck like a horse with blinders, right? You can't
Mhm.
see everything around you in order to decide the best way to move, right? You've got blinders, but within your little scope, you can freely move forward, you can freely stop, you can freely go this, you know what I mean? Like you're
Yeah.
kind of limited within the determined that you were determined to be in the times, place, abilities. I'm not a basketball player because I don't have that genetics for it.
Right.
Um, so I could never freely choose to do that. But I could freely choose to try.
Right.
So that would be the compatibilist view. Whereas a libertarian view would be like there is no causal connections to you that would prevent you from doing anything you want. In other words, a libertarian would say you are free from, like, if, it doesn't matter if you were born in, say, India.
Hmm.
If you don't choose Christianity, you deserve to go to hell for it because you could have freely chosen to be Christian. Now, a compatibilist would say, well, maybe he didn't know about Christianity to know to make that choice, and so it kind of limits his movement there.
Right.
But a libertarian would disagree.
Right. Well, I guess I would say, one, I don't know the complete answer, or I don't know. I can tell you what I believe.
Hmm.
And what I believe is that probably God has placed everyone in the place where it's the best opportunity for them to have the chance to ultimately themselves find a pathway that would lead them to a place where they would recognize they are imperfect, and in that imperfection they need something outside of themselves to help them, that they would be dependent upon something else. And I think to a light that someone's given, that's what they're responsible for. I mean, ultimately, the Bible says that there's no other name under heaven by which man can be saved except for the name of Jesus. And it says that I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Notice those two verses don't say that unless you have prayed a prayer and done this kind of a thing, that's how Jesus gets applied to you. Those verses say is that anyone who does get saved, they go through the pathway that is Jesus Christ and what he did on the cross. So what Jesus did on the cross is the thing that saves anyone that gets saved. But I think what God does is he knows the intent of man's heart better than any of us. And if you're in a place where you've never heard the name Jesus, first of all, if God is perfectly just, which if he's perfect in all ways righteous, he would be perfectly just, then it would mean that person, just because they didn't hear about the name of Jesus, that would not keep them from being able to be saved. That would be imperfect justice. I think it means that if that person they are capable of getting to a point of saying, God, I don't know who you are. I don't know how you would save, but I know I can't save myself. And I know I can't be perfect as you're perfect, or whatever I understand of perfection. God, will you make apply to me whatever it is that is your perfect remedy? I don't know what that thing is, but will you apply it to me? I think God, in his perfect love, perfect justice, perfect compassion, perfect all those things, will apply that to that person.
Yeah,
Because
and the mysterious thing is he knew all of that, and it was
before
already
the
going to
foundations
happen.
of the earth were laid.
Yeah, it was all going to happen from the beginning either way.
Yes.
And I think that for a lot of unbelievers, you'll hear a lot of this is that and it goes to whose standards of justice, whose standards of perfection, whose standards, because a lot of times we make the taxi, at least a lot of believers do. I've seen this, they make this taxi cab fallacy where they'll apply their own sense of, well, that can't be true because that would be unjust. But
Right.
then if you point out some things that we would all agree are unjust, they'll say, oh, well, God's ways are higher than our ways. It's like they jump out of that taxi when it's convenient and then
Yeah.
jump back in when it's convenient. So,
I don't
I
think we
think,
know what perfect justice is.
right. So I was about to
Yeah.
say that. So we make this claim
Yes.
that God is perfect in all his justice, and you could make just a very simple thought experiment.
Hmm.
I think that other YouTubers out here make, and I like them a lot, and I'll borrow them and use them. Let's say we have the idea of poof or drown, which was kind of made famous by Doug Pine Creek,
Hmm.
where he'll say, well, let's say Yahweh during the flood of Noah
Hmm.
pulled you to the side and said, hey, Greg, look, I'm going to give you the decision making power right now. I'm going to go ahead, I was going to go ahead and drown all the people in the world, including the infants and babies and everything like that, just drown them under the water till their lungs filled with water and they perished in
Hmm.
suffering. Or I can snap my finger and teleport them out of that situation and relocate them in my God relocation plan
Hmm.
and just zap them into heaven or
Hmm.
hell or wherever I want to send them so they don't have to suffer as
Right.
little infants, right?
Hmm.
But I'm going to leave this decision up to you. What would you like to do? Would you choose poof or drown in that situation?
What would I choose? I'd probably
Yeah,
choose poof.
yes. And so, what that thought experiment does, it sort of pits your ethics against Yahweh in the
Hmm.
Bible, the story there. And so, it gives people something to think about. And a lot of people who question the morality of the Bible God would
Hmm.
say, it seems like I'm more moral than the God that you hold up. And then, of course, the tax cab fallacy will come in and say, oh, well, that's because you don't know the ways of God. God had a purpose for why he wanted to drown them rather than poof them out of existence. And this is not very satisfying for a lot of unbelievers because they want to have some sort of resolution. They feel like, well, suffering is bad. It seems we all agree to that.
Hmm.
Especially if you put your own personal situation into it. Like, let's say I went to, you came over to my house and I was in my backyard and, You just happened to walk by. You saw me drowning my son, holding his head down and drowning him in the water till he died. You would say that's terrible, right?
Right.
Um, but then I'd tell you, well, God told me to do it. Then I guess the next thing you'd say is, well, how do I know God told you to do that?
Right.
And then suppose I just made it clear to you, or God made it clear to you. Yeah, I told him to do that. This is my will. Um, in fact,
Well, so you get
we
into
need to,
divine command theories, which
yeah,
basically
you
what you
start
get
getting
into,
into, right. You start getting to means to an
which is
end
why I think divine
fallacies and
command theory is wrong.
right, right. So how do
Yeah.
you resolve those sort of situations?
Well, see, divine command theory basically says that as an arbitrary product, he decides what he wants to do, and whatever he decides, actually, because of the nature of who he is, it becomes what's okay.
Hmm.
And um, there's a difference between, I think, the God of the Bible and that kind of a God. God doesn't do something because he arbitrarily feels it's a certain way. He does it because he is a certain way. So his essence is going to drive whatever it is that is the nature of what transpires. So um, when I guess when you throw out your drowning question about, okay, wait a minute, it sounds like you would be more righteous than God in poofing people away. That assumes that God has not poofed some people away. Um, we know, well, we believe, at least in some places in the Bible, that there were at least two people that got poofed away, Elijah and Enoch. But everyone else goes through death. All of us go through some measure of suffering at the end of
Hmm.
life, right? Okay.
Yes, and let me say this too, that on naturalism, that it doesn't change a thing. On
Yes.
naturalism, we still go through evolution, which is a very harsh, cold sort of natural process that entails
Yeah.
suffering and immeasurable food chain suffering and things like. But the only difference is the naturalist doesn't have to justify nature in the same way that a
Right.
theist who believes in this all loving, which is a completely loving, perfect
Right.
being, and so which would require some sort of interpretation, some sort of inferences, some sort of argumentation to sort of justify it.
Right.
And under naturalism, you just say, well, the God we, the God we believe in, sort of is just a process. It's kind
Right.
of blind, or it's not. It's kind of indifferent, even if it was conscious or intelligent, which I do. I kind of lean towards a very intelligent universe
Mhm.
sort of scenario, just based on my intuition. Um,
Right.
but even with that, it just simply shows that this sort of intelligence is indifferent, that it's free of any moral or ethical blame. Now, you could make the argument then, well, nature is immoral. I can agree to that, I guess. If a boulder rolls down a hill and kills somebody, nature killed them for no reason, you might reason.
Right.
But if you take the idea that, well, nature is sort of blind and doesn't really do these things, there's no intention behind everything it does. It's just a happenstance, like a tornado rips through a neighborhood or whatever. You know what I mean? Whereas a
Right.
God who's in control of everything has the ability to stop that from happening, and yet
Right.
he lets it happen. And so for the unbeliever, this becomes that problem, despite everything you're saying, that it's just an unfolding and it's all part of God's will. Maybe it's a means to an end. Maybe the good that God's going to arrive us at is going to far outweigh the moment, because I mean, this is just a vapor, right? This
Right.
life here is just a vapor, but then we still have eternal hellfire that goes on forever, you know. And then we
So
have the
yeah.
definitions of all loving, which is, when I think of all, I mean like everything, like there's no place for anything different.
Right. So I mean, I think what you end up in a place is it's either that God does it arbitrarily, or it is a a happen something that happens as in line with his essence. I mean, it happens. It's going to happen, determined by his essence. Um, if it's arbitrary, then it means God's choosing to do these things, which are unloving, that are not compassionate. I think I'm trying to think of where, because you've got me at a couple of different places now.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah.
I'm trying to think of which
Just take one
what place
at
to
a
answer
time.
first.
Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of which one to try to address first. I guess I'll go to the problem of evil
Okay.
as it exists. Um, yeah, question, I guess, becomes, is that something that God is the arbiter of, or is the one that made it, or is that the result of my efforts as a willful being? I think God's will is good, perfect, and pleasing. It is the standard, the definition of what that is.
Hmm.
From the standpoint of, it is the only one that is good, perfect, and pleasing that matters, because he is the sustainer and giver of life. And so if I'm not in line with his good, perfect, and pleasing will, then I end up in a place where I experience what is death and pain and all of those things that happen absent of his, what would be in line with his will, his essence. For me to have my own will, to have my own identity, I have to have my ability to be able to choose. And what God is saying is that anytime I choose anything outside of his will, even if it's super good, all it has to be is different from him to no longer be compatible with him. If I'm no longer compatible with him, I get what it means not to have him. And anything that is absent of him is actually what are the things that you're describing: the pain, the suffering, all those kinds of things. Those happen when you operate outside of his will.
Okay, so let's set that aside, and let's
Okay.
say that a little 2-year-old baby
Mm-hmm.
was killed by a hurricane.
Yes.
Um, was that operating outside of God's? Was that child operating outside of God's will, or how do we?
Well, the world operates outside of his will at that point. Everything, hurricanes, all that kind of stuff happens after the fall. So there would be no 2-year-olds that would be in a state where they would be outside of God's will prior to the fall.
Okay.
So
Okay.
now we're operating in a world that has fallen. And when you operate in a world that has fallen, unfortunately, even the innocent can experience consequence.
Mm,
And God actually describes that and says that. But
yeah.
that's a matter of our failings, not his failings at that
Okay. And
point.
all of this was, um, you
Foreknown
know,
before.
all it was all foreknown, foreknowledge and all of that. So
Yes.
that again, those are the sort of emotional, I guess, issues people have, because people may um personally go through situations where they see their child die, or unfortunately go through a lot of, and they wonder. Even Christians, I've seen Christians leave the faith because of things like that.
Right.
It's just got so personal to them, and so it didn't seem to actually serve God's purpose. It seemed, if anything, it sort of drove them away from God. So it leaves the question of why. You know what I mean?
I would say because they're thinking very humanly about things. They are thinking as people who don't understand perfection, and because you don't understand perfection, we get caught in the emotions of those things. Um, com- Perfection is uncompromising. It has to
Could we
be.
s- could we say that about really anything that we don't understand? That it's just God's mysterious, nature, or we're just not meant to know it,
Um, I'm not sure if meant to know it and capable
or
of knowing it.
capable?
Yeah,
Like, could we just
and I think
explain
you can
anything?
begin to know it. I think you can
Hmm.
begin to understand it. I mean, there's a reason why God says that He's transforming us by the renewing of our minds. He can help us begin to understand and see things better from His perspective. The problem is that most of us are fighting Him so hard that it's really hard to ever begin to see anything from God's perspective.
Well, yeah. Well, then too, it could be a very big put off. I mean, suppose you suppose that, just kind of entering your worldview, suppose this God is real, everything you say here
Mhm.
is totally true, and you've got somebody who actually understands all these things. God
Yeah.
helped them work through it to understand all these things. So when they see it, a mother comes to him with a child that's been, burned to death in a car or something like that, and he couldn't save
Right.
his life, and he's all broken up. Well, talks to this Christian pastor or whoever that understands all these things. Why are you sad? This is God's plan. This is a good thing. Like,
Mm.
how is that going to,
I'm not
you
sure
know,
God's
un-
plan ever was for any children to get burned.
but see, that's what I'm driving at, is that
Yeah.
then the question becomes, is it really God's plan that this happened? And then
Mhm.
if you say no, it's not God's plan, then we're saying that God was kind of out of control, or um and I know that, I
Then
think you
that
said
throws it over
something
to
at the
free will.
beginning that he kind of let the reins go, out of respect for his creation, to be able to make those sort of decisions.
Not out of
um
respect, because it's because unless he allows them to operate according to their free will, they don't have the capability of worship. Without true free will, there is no worship. There's only
okay.
self-worship.
And then, we come to responsibility. um
Yes.
it seems one thought experiment I like to point out, and that I kind of think about, is, let's say I'm a mad scientist and I go into a lab and I create these AI robots,
Mhm.
you know, robots that have their own free will, their own mind of their own. Well, I let them out of the lab and they go out and they murder, rape, and do all sorts of terrible things out here in the world. And of course, in any court of law, I'm going to be held responsible because I'm the manufacturer of these AI robots.
Yeah.
Is that fair that I be held responsible? I created them, but they have free will. Why am I responsible? It's like,
Yeah.
if I have a child, am I responsible for when my child grows up? And you know what I
Yeah.
mean? It's like, a lot of people will say, "Well, God created us, so isn't
Mhm.
he the prime mover? Isn't he the
Yeah.
first cause, so to speak? So doesn't he at least share some of the blame for the evil in the world?"
Right. I think that's you remember I said you start with what happened with the angels, and it actually matters the order that you look at the things. You're asking all the right questions. I think you're asking them out of order.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah,
because
the fall.
when you ask them out of order, what ends up happening is you end up answering just that question, but that question was dependent upon something else, and
Is
we
it
were missing the
possible?
context. I
Right.
would say that the answer to your question probably ultimately is, well, there's a reason why Jesus is the one who dies on the cross,
Hmm. Okay.
because if he gave us free will, he understands and understood that we would choose outside of that will. He
Hmm.
understood there had to be a remedy, and he knew the only remedy was that he would have to die for us.
Hmm.
And he proves
It.
that, I think, through we haven't even talked about evolution and creation, what we came on to talk about, really. I think
Yeah, because
all the
you sort
iterations of
of.
man, actually, and
Hmm.
all of the iterations of what God created actually demonstrate the answers to all the things that you're asking. Why didn't he
How
create
so? Hmm.
why didn't God create a situation where everything was just as good as he was, but had their own identity? The only thing that was different about them was that they were not him. He
Hmm.
did that. He did that with the angels, and the angels still were going to choose outside of his will, because to have your own identity, to have your own will, by definition, eventually invariably, you will choose something outside of his will, or
Is
all
there
he had
free
created was
will?
something.
Is
Yes.
there free will in heaven or in God's kingdom?
Um, ultimately, I think there's only two places where there's true free will. There's free will the first time you choose to walk outside of God's good, perfect, and pleasing will. At that point, you become a slave to your sin and self. You basically become a slave to your own will. And you can never choose to go back to a point where you were perfect, because even then you'd be coming from a place of imperfection at that point. The only other choice that you have is the time where God has softens your heart, because if you're a slave to your sin and self, you're hardened against being able to choose God's will. You can only choose what is best in your own eyes at that point.
Mhm. Hmm.
You are driven by your greatest love at that point. You don't
Hmm.
have a will. Um, but God softens your heart and allows you to have a free will choice. What will you do with my remedy? I have presented you with an opportunity to have this reconciled, to have this done away with, this problem. All you have to do is say, God, I want to place my trust in what you did, not what I could do. I want
Okay.
to have you apply your remedy. And if you'll choose that, what you end up in a place is where you get what does Christianity say comes when you accept Christ on the cross? It's two words. There's
Freedom. I mean, there's
mm,
salvation. There's freedom. There's so many
well,
things that you can.
I actually think freedom is the thing that's talked about in the Bible, where it says that there's a way that seems right to a man, but in the end it leads only to death.
Hmm.
Most people would say that's talking about sin, because you'll live with sin for a while and it seems pleasurable, but in the end it'll kill you. Yes, that's true, but I don't think that's what that's talking about. I think it's talking about that when you exercise your will, your freedom is actually the way that leads to death. Because as soon as you exercise your will outside of his will, you actually walk away by definition from good, perfect, and pleasing. You become imperfect, and now you actually are incompatible with the only thing that gives you life.
So, just to kind of get back, trap things
If
back.
you don't mind, let
Mhm,
me say the answer though, because I
mhm.
said there's two things that Christianity presents as being what happens with
Okay.
saving. It's grace and mercy,
Oh,
right?
yes. Uh-huh.
Okay.
Grace and mercy. Correct.
So by
Right.
definition, are grace and mercy just?
I don't think so. The
They
the
aren't.
concepts don't seem very just to me.
Yeah, you get what you don't deserve, and you
Yeah.
don't get what you do deserve. So
Right.
if that's the case, and God says the wages of sin is death, what has to happen to all of
You
us?
have to die.
You all have to
Um,
die.
yeah. Now, let's just, I'm just walking into your worldview. I'm
Yeah.
granting you all of that.
Yes.
You've laid out your case. Now we're going to go back to real quick, because I know I
Creation.
want to respect your time, but we're going to go back to the original topic of the show,
Sorry.
saying all of that, discussing all of those things. I think that was kind of important to get that out, because they sort of lay the groundwork of where we're coming from.
Worldview. Yep.
Now, from you did say that you sort of um, subscribe. I don't want to say believe, but you subscribe, or you understand, might be a better word. Evolution by natural selection, the process, as a way God does things, but you just say He's kind of the power behind the spark of
Yeah.
life and the spark of evolution. Now, having said that,
I would say that's a possibility. I would say
possibility,
also
okay,
young earth creationism is a
is a
possibility.
possibility. You
Yeah,
are
in the
you leaning towards the evolution? Or are you leaning towards special creation?
I lean towards punctuated equilibrium more than I
Okay, yeah.
do towards
Hmm.
Darwinian
Hmm.
evolution. I
Okay.
think probably what has transpired is that Satan um, tried to work through the one means that he could use, which is manipulation, since he can't create. And what he did was he probably tried to work through Darwinian evolution. It didn't work, and um, not to the extent that he wanted, which was true speciation, leading all the way to the creation of man. And what God ended up doing was stepping in 6 different times and doing in 24-hour a day what Satan couldn't do in billions of years.
Okay. So, having said that, um, would how do how can we test any of this? Like,
You
how,
can't.
like, just putting my science hat on as somebody who's trying to come at this as from a more scientific view. Um, you say this can't be really tested, or
Well, I would say
scientifically.
it can't be any more. It can't be tested as to whether or not God did it. I
Hmm.
think it is probably the way you would test to see if there's a possibility that God did it would be to ask the question, did God state it in his word before mankind ever thought of the concepts? And
Hmm.
I think it's the possibility that God in the Bible actually stated that there was evolutionary process that was somehow involved, but maybe in some form or another. But and that happened and was stated that way before anyone else ever thought of it. In which case, you'd have to
Hmm.
ask, how did they know to write that? It was either a really good guess, or maybe someone led them to think that way.
So, do you believe that man is an ape? that has a common ancestor with other apes that are alive today?
I think it's potentially the case.
Potentially the
I'm
case.
not
Okay.
saying that it is the
What is your
case.
confidence on that, would you say? Where would you put it?
Uh,
1 to 10?
um, I guess I don't even want to give it one because I don't think that matters. Because I
Well,
think and then they tell me why I don't think it matters. I think if it's potentially could be the young Earth way biblically, if it could be Darwinian evolution biblically, if it could be punctuated equilibrium biblically, if we're just saying any of the views that we think actually could be the ones that were spoken of biblically, we don't know which one it was. And at the end of the day, all of those lead to the feet of the cross where we are a sinner in need of a savior. Then
mhm.
spiritually speaking, it really doesn't matter which mechanism was the right mechanism.
I guess then the reason I asked that question
Yeah.
is it's sort of philosophical.
Yes.
It seems that if we it seems like you've got Adam and Eve, which I'm not sure if you're a literalist on this. It sounds like maybe it's something different for you, like kind
I'm
of
a
an
literalist.
analogy
I
in a
think
way. You are
no,
a
I don't think
literalist.
there's any analogy about it. I think there is
Okay,
an absolute Adam and Eve, but I also don't think
okay,
I also I'm not convinced that Adam and Eve are the first man and woman,
gotcha.
and I think
So,
that is actually probably something that's biblical,
mhm.
and I could walk
Oh,
you through that if you wanted to see it. So,
yeah, let's hear it. I'd be interested.
um, so the Bible says that Adam was the first man who was a living being. It doesn't say that he was the first man. It says he was the first man who was a living being.
Mm,
Eve was the mother of all the living. I think there's a reason why it doesn't say she was the mother of all mankind. It says the mother of the living. If you go back to Genesis chapter 2, it says that God breathed into the dust and he made Adam a living being. He makes him something that's uniquely different than what was created in Genesis chapter 1, which in that case was someone who was an image bearer. Um, and so I think the image bearers are actually Genesis chapter 1, potentially. I'm not saying this is the way it is. I'm saying this is a possibility. It could be that is absolutely Adam and Eve are the first man and woman. I just think the Bible leaves it the possibility that Genesis chapter 1 was the creation of all mankind, and that 6,000 years ago, God stepped in. He created one man and one woman that actually served as a representative for mankind who had already fallen. And they did that in the Garden of Eden. And as they went, the rest of mankind would go. So
mhm.
sin and death enter the world because of what Adam and Eve did, because they were the representative of everyone else. But what we're not talking about physical death there. What we're talking about is spiritual death, separation from God for eternity.
Mhm. Now,
So
aside from the narrative in
yeah,
the Genesis book of Genesis, if it were not for that book, let's say that book, you had no knowledge of it,
yeah,
you didn't know about it, but you did know the science,
yes.
what would you conclude about the origin? Would you still come to that same conclusions more or less, or
I think
would
I
it have
would.
no bearing?
I
Okay,
think I
you would.
would, because the genome projects, when you look at it, if you look at everything other than the Hebrew race gets a much greater level of specificity in terms of what you can see in the genome about them. It actually looks different than everything else.
Hmm.
And at least there's papers that are written that way. I'm not, I would have to do a whole lot of talking with people that know a lot more than I do to
Hmm.
do a peer review on those. And I don't know that a peer review has been done on that. I think it would be worth looking into. But from what I have read, um, you can see with a much greater level of specificity the type of Jew that you have, where they were, and all that kind of stuff. Part of that is probably because they didn't intermarry as much as everything else. So there may be that may be part of it. Part of it may also be because they're younger.
Okay. So your belief that punctuated equilibrium, um, the Genesis account of well, you
Creation.
wouldn't
Yeah.
have Genesis. You wouldn't have known about it. So I'm trying to make sense of my own thought experiment here. So you don't know what is said in Genesis. So you wouldn't know anything about the Jewish people, but I guess you would have the science to understand the Jewish people, at
The
least
Jew.
from that aspect.
You're asking, if
Um,
you're asking me from my time zone where I am today, in this date, I would know about that.
Right.
If I were back then, how I would know it is probably because Genesis chapter 6, the Son of God having relations with the daughters of men. I think there's a reason why it says the males of the fallen pre-Adamic lines, when they had relations with the daughters of Adam's line, they actually saw a genetic mutation that happened. It was giants. It was the Nephilim. If you saw it going the other direction, if you had the males like Cain, where did he find his wife? He found it from among the pre-Adamic lines. And when he would have relations with a woman that was from a pre-Adamic line, they didn't see the genetic mutation. Therefore, they would look and probably say, either you are from our line or you're who you claim you are, which is that you came from Adam's line.
Mm-hmm. That it's really interesting how you're sort of putting these things together, which kind of fits in a few of the misunderstandings and can kind of at least explain and have a sort of logic behind the stories.
The
Now, a lot of,
contradictions that are
yeah,
there.
and a lot of Christians, unfortunately, I know firsthand, they would
They would
definitely
say it's
disagree with
heresy.
you. It's heresy, and the reason why, well, they'd give you all kinds of reasons. There's just
Well, they
thousands of
go
different
back
reasons.
to church history, and this is how we've always talked about it, and that kind of a thing. I think the word should speak
And
for itself.
right, well, it can become sort of a stumbling block for a lot of people
Yeah.
to think either way, really. Um,
And
you
that's why
know,
I don't put down a hard anchor and say it has to be this way or that way. I say I believe it may be more. I believe more about this way, but I'm going to tell you all the different possibilities and say this is biblical and this is backed by this evidence. You make the determination as to what you believe about
okay,
it. You have to be convinced yourself.
right.
And yeah.
Now, and this kind of gets to the crux of it, and it's kind of a good way to really segue into that. I always like to understand what is the driver behind these beliefs, right?
Mhm.
So it sounds like, because you would believe these things with or without the Bible, from what I understand. You just told me that
Mhm.
that reason being the genome of the Jewish people, the Jewish lineage.
That's one thing. You asked me about how I would know about the Jewish people.
Perfect. Okay, so
That
what
was the
is your number one reason for belief in these sort of things?
um, I don't know that there is one reason.
I mean, or
Uh,
most
uh,
important, you might say,
um,
or the first thing that pops in your mind when you think Christianity is true, or my version, or my
I think the
understanding of
observable evidence supports it.
observable. Which ones?
Um, uh, if we look and we say that we think evolution is true, let's say we think
Mhm.
evolution is true. I think the book of Genesis says that basically anything that's inanimate, God spoke to and said, um, that he spoke to the natural and commanded it to do something. And what I find very fascinating is that when it says that it does these things after their kind, if you look at those things that are being created in the book of Genesis, it's always the last thing that's on Darwin's evolutionary branch.
Mhm.
So if you ask where are the dinosaurs in the creation account, it's on the line of the kinds that go and become the birds.
Mhm.
If you ask about where man comes from, well, it's interesting that Genesis 1:24 and 25, right before it talks about God creating man, and he makes them in his image, he creates them male and female. It says that he creates the living creatures, and those creatures are what are called nephesh chapha, I think is what it is in the Hebrew. It basically has a connotation of humanity to it. If you look at the beast of the earth and the terminology that's used there, it is something that means a living being. It doesn't mean a living creature or an animal. It actually has a human connotation to it. I think it's actually describing the hominids when it talks about the beast of the earth. And that would be the last thing on the line of the mammalian things on the evolutionary branch.
Okay.
So I think it follows what science has been telling us, and therefore, if I'm not going to disagree with what science says, why would I disagree with what the Bible is seemingly saying?
Okay.
Now, the only thing that is the basis of why do I conclude that it's a God and not a God? And that's a
Yeah, I
step of
mean,
faith. That's a step of faith.
that's kind of a step of faith. And then,
It is.
and we can, and then that kind of goes into another topic because it depends on how we're defining the God. Now, I know you're a Christian, so I
Yes.
understand your definition of God, of course. Um, let's see, what was the other thing I was going to ask you? Um, if hmm, it just kind of went over my head. It just
It left you.
went away.
No
Went
worries.
away. I had a really good question and it just went
Well,
away.
one thing I think that's really interesting, I just stumbled into this when I was reading the Bible. And so, if you don't mind me talking about this, I think it's a fascinating
Sure.
thing. Obviously, there's the 5 days of creation, or the 6 days of creation, right? And pretty much every day ends with, and God looked on whatever he made, and he pronounces it as good. And he says there's evening and morning, the first day, the second day, the third day. But it's always this: there's the evening and morning, and then there's the day. It's
Hmm.
really interesting when you see the transition from day 5 to day 6. There's a section that's written in verses 24 and 25 where he says that then he created the living creatures. He created the cattle after their kind, the creeping things after their kind, the beasts of the earth after their kind. And then he pronounces those as being good, but he breaks his pattern. He doesn't describe it as being, and then there was a morning, evening and a morning, and that was the end of the day. It rolls into, then he creates man, and he does this, and he pronounced them as very good. There was evening and a morning, the sixth day. And so everyone takes that to mean that, well, this stuff must be part of the sixth day, but does it have to be? It's
Hmm.
interesting, in every other day or every other creation moment that he does, he creates and he says, he does everything that's going to happen in that day. And then he says, he pronounces it good, evening, morning, the day. With
Hmm.
mammals, he didn't do that.
Hmm.
And, and,
Right.
and I find it fascinating because it makes me wonder, it's seemingly there's an event that would take place where you would go from what seemingly would be what led to the birds and creatures that went back into the ocean as the great sea creatures. You
Hmm.
had something that transpired that would be cataclysmic and make a huge change that would lead to mammals. We know that as being the asteroid or whatever that struck the Earth 65 million
Hmm.
years ago.
Hmm.
That doesn't sound like the kind of thing that a God who's a loving and compassionate God would send upon, and yet he uses it as a stair step and pronounces it as good. Is it possible that that was a step that actually he did not have as one of his days, but it actually was an event that he took what Satan meant for evil and turned it to good?
Hmm.
And if Satan was looking and saying, hey, wait a minute, I've proven, I have demonstrated that I can't make something from nothing. I've demonstrated that I can't make the living from the non-living. And I know this is all leading to man, where God has said, this is a part of my solution, my answer to your accusation, which is why God calls Satan Satan. I am going to use mankind as the way to defeat you and show you
Right.
that you're wrong. That Satan would step in and say, then I'm going to destroy it all. And God says, oh, thank you very much. You've actually done the one step that I wouldn't do. You did this thing, and now I turn it to good, and I allow mammals to come. I think it's
Gotcha.
fascinating.
Yeah, it is very interesting. Thought about what I was going to try to ask you. Okay.
Please go ahead.
So well, first of all, let me ask you this. Do you believe that we see reality as it really is?
No,
No. Okay.
I don't know
I
that
am the
any
same
of us
as
do.
you in
Yeah.
that respect. So, and this gets back on track with what we were talking about.
Yeah.
There's this evolutionary game theory that
Okay.
says that the more an animal species, anything, knows the truth about its environment, about reality,
Hmm.
the less likely it is that it's going to survive. That actually, our intuition says no. If we see things more accurately and more true, it seems like that would be something that would help us survive and procreate. But actually, that in actuality, we have like a million examples that that is not true. Not just with us, but with all other creatures as well.
Yeah.
Um, and so we have this evolutionary game theory that tells us that we did not evolve to actually know the truth or understand the truth, that we actually, our strength is in the fact that we see just enough
Dimly.
to survive and to procreate, and that's all we really need to do. That what and it's not that we have an incomplete experience of the world. We actually have no idea what we're looking at. When we look at energy, when we look at mass, when we look at matter, we're not
Yeah.
seeing anything that resembles the truth of the matter at all. And in fact, our brain sort of generates a sort of interface.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like a computer where, you have these little icons that stands for your recycle bin. One is your files of all the stuff you're working on, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
When you've got your little symbol for sending an email, you just click on the icon and you compose your email and send it out. Now, if you actually had to know the truth about that little icon, you would understand that it's a data structure. But beyond that, it's transistors, the hardware, the electricity, all the little intricacies that make the computer turn on.
Hmm.
It goes even beyond that. It goes way beyond that. And so if you had to know all of that stuff, you would never send a person an email to begin with. That's the whole point of the interface, is to make it very convenient for you to get your work done, right?
Yes.
Now, that's not to say that you don't take it seriously. You don't want to drag your file into the recycle bin, because then you've deleted all your work, right?
Yeah.
So you have to take it serious, but you have to take it serious within the framework of the interface, right?
Yes.
And so, what evolutionary theory is telling us is that we have sort of an interface that's kind of that we all sort of share as a species to kind of understand reality a certain kind of way.
Hmm.
But we don't understand the metaphysical truth about these things, right?
Yeah. Not
Um,
completely.
not completely. And even, we have another thing that's a theorem. It's not a theory, it's a theorem. And a theorem is something that's proven, it's
Hmm.
true, regardless we like it or not. And it's called Gödel's incompleteness theorem. And what that tells us is that you can come to any sort of um, you know, premise, axiom, but your axiom will always be incomplete. You're always going to have to explain the axiom that you've
Yeah.
built your framework and
You
beliefs
can
on.
always get closer and closer and closer, but you
And it
never
just,
actually reach,
yeah,
because
and
it
it
not
just
actually is
goes.
one much smaller. Yeah.
Yeah, because once you explain the axiom, you have to develop another axiom and another framework to explain that axiom. And it just goes on forever and
Yeah.
ever and ever.
Infinite regress.
And infinite regress, right? And so
Yeah.
that's an epistemic issue, and it's something we never really understand. And so then we take evolutionary game theory that sort of tells us all that, shows us all that. And then we also have physics today, which is the consensus now, is that what we see is the used to be thought of that the Big Bang, the observable universe, was the beginning of it all. But we actually understand now
Infinite.
that actually this isn't. It's only the beginning of an expansion. But
Hmm.
beyond that, we don't know what it is. And we basically can reduce. We can use reductionism and materialism down to 10 to the 24th power. That's it.
Hmm.
After that, the laws of math break down, laws of physics break down. We can't measure anything beyond that point. Now, a lot of
Hmm.
materialists will have, sort of died on that hill that, no, 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 there's nothing but matter, there's nothing but mass, there's nothing but that. But now we understand
Hmm.
that even time, space, and of course, everything within time, space, like matter, energy, and all of this stuff, emerges from time, space. And then time, space itself emerges from an even deeper fundamental thing. And so now we have these other models out here, like,
Information
um,
horizons and all that
yeah,
kind of
we've got
stuff going on.
information theory. And that
Yep.
even that quantum fields, which is information theory, is not the
Yeah.
fundamental thing. Those things also emerge from deeper
Hmm.
structures within reality. And science has a really cool way of using that mathematics to get to it. Now, we can't get to that through our interface, because
Yeah.
our interface is not there to show us the truth. Our interface is there to show us a lie so that we can survive and procreate. That does nothing for,
Yes.
you're not going to pick up a hot chick by talking about, you know, these sort of things, right?
Right,
But
right.
luckily, we have these tools, these analytical tools that work very well. They're rigorous enough to give
Yeah,
us these sort of indications. And so, I guess my whole idea there is if I tend to lean towards believing this. I'm not one who puts a lot of stock in my own knowledge and in my own omniscience. I don't think I am.
I think that's
And
probably
so,
pretty wise.
yeah, I think that's gonna,
For
yeah,
all
I
of
think
us.
that's
All of us should be
realistic.
that way. Yes.
Exactly. And so, but if that's the case, then it sort of calls into question any sort of worldview, for me personally. So I would say that, yeah, actually being religious, falling for Christianity will help get me laid because there's a lot of Christian women
Mhm.
out here that need to get married and want to have children, and it helps the species further on. Same with any religious worldview or political worldview or what have you. Social constructs are for that very purpose, all part of that
Does
interface.
naturalism do that too?
And naturalism can do that too. Yes, it
Yes,
can. You can find all of these things that way.
absolutely.
And
So any
so
belief system.
any belief system, any worldview is very limited, and it's very
Yeah,
it's not designed to show you the truth. It's only there to kind of help you understand what works. And so I'm sort of a methodological materialist in the sense that I think we can measure the world to a certain point. Like I said, 10 to the 24th power. We can measure all that stuff and get back all and describe everything we see.
yeah,
Beyond that, we just have no access to that.
yeah. We
And
start
so,
moving beyond the material.
yeah. And so when we start talking about these worldviews like materialism, like supernaturalism, all of these things, I'm just like, you know what, guys, I'm kind of out of the conversation at that point because I'm kind of talking out of my pay grade right now, and I think everyone else is too.
Yes.
I think it's just it's fun, it's interesting, it's cool. Anyone can develop a framework
Yeah.
and
The step
logically
of
tie
faith.
it all together. Is it true? I'm just glad that you're an agnostic about it, that you're able to admit you don't know. It
Yeah.
works for you for whatever reasons, and it does for a lot of people. Nothing
Right.
wrong with that. And so that's kind of where I wanted to get with the conversation, is just to kind of get
Interesting.
to that point, because there's a lot of people in our audience out here that are Gnostics, Gnostic
Yeah.
atheists, Gnostic, theists in every stripe. And I think that that's just a little dishonest if I'm just being honest to myself.
Right. Well, and then I put on my preacher's hat because then I do look at it and I say, okay, I know everyone hates Pascal's wager, or at least if you're, in particular, if you're an atheist. But because then you could say, well, how do you know it's your God that's the right God and all that kind of stuff. And at the end of the day, though, if there is a possibility of it being wrong, I do think that the atheist probably has the most to lose.
Are you sure? Let's turn that around.
Yeah.
Suppose
Or has the greatest
God,
probability has the greatest
yeah,
probability of loss.
suppose, and we don't know whether this is true. I'm not saying it is true, but
Yeah.
suppose God wants to stay hidden and wants to give you just enough information to run with
Right.
beliefs, but not enough information to prove it. And he's testing you to see whether you're really going to be
Mhm.
gullible or whether you're going to
Right.
be agnostic and just kind of and be honest with yourself. And at the end of the day, God say, hey, you believers, you
Yeah.
failed the test, man. You got to do it again, or you got to go to hell, or whatever the case may be. And the
Yeah.
atheists is the ones who are agnostic. They're the ones that win the reward because they got through the matrix soundly. They were honest. They were using what they had to make the right inferences, correct inferences, without being arrogant and without letting the appeal to emotion cloud their judgment. It could
Right.
be the Pascal's wager can work that way.
I
And
hadn't thought
so,
about it that way.
yeah,
So I will say I will give some thought to that. Um, uh, I guess where we all end up is the place of where do we convinced of,
where
and
I learned, where I figured that out. Yeah, of
what's
all
that?
places, really weird.
Uh-huh.
NDE.
What's that
There's
now?
a few near-death
Oh,
experience.
near-death experience.
There's
Okay.
a few
Yeah.
people that relayed near-death experience, and they said God is putting on a big show, a big test. And those
Interesting.
who are believers into all these, it's not just being gullible, but this also leads to wars and family breakups, divisions in the world, all over these sort of beliefs that people are so certain about.
Yeah.
And God is saying he's sort of using this, he's using that test in order to evolve mankind. He's actually
Yeah.
trying to move people into a more rational and spiritual minded place, which he's saying
Mm.
these beliefs, these religions are like first step spirituality. Like they're like kindergarten. And once you get through kindergarten in this life, you go through it again and you kind of evolve the human race overall. I'm not saying I believe any of that. I think it's all
Right.
foolish.
Right.
But I'm just saying that it's Pascal's wager turned on its head, is all I'm kind of
This is very interesting. I'll
going
have to give that some thought. But um, yeah, I guess at the end of the day, uh, like I said, we're all convinced about what we're convinced of,
We really are.
and
Mhm.
I guess the only thing I guess I feel impressed upon myself to do is to at least say this is why I believe what I believe and tell the people what I believe, and then give them the opportunity to think about it themselves and make a determination.
That's what it's
And
for. That's what life's
right,
for,
that's
man.
right,
That's
and
You're doing exactly what everyone else is doing, whether they call themselves a
right,
naturalist, atheist, whatever. You're just going by how you understand reality the
yeah,
best way you can. And this is why we have these discussions, just to kind
yes,
of throw ideas back. I'm going to think about everything you've said, review our video, and I'm definitely going to take it serious and take a look at it because I've heard a
yeah,
lot of things. And this is one of those ideas I find very interesting. And I want
good,
to do that. And I think
good,
we're just these sort of conversations are healthy, whether
yeah,
you believe it's a supernatural divine intervention that is evolving mankind. One thing I can say is that we are evolving, we are changing as a species and as a culture and society. And it's when we're doing that, the more healthy way is through these sort of conversations, even
yes.
if they're about religion and about a lot of things we might reject or accept.
And this is what I try to tell Christians, my fellow Christians, that I do think we should go and tell people about the gospel, but I think we need to do it in a tone that allows for the other person to make a determination. I think sometimes we try to, and probably out of a sense of urgency, because we really do care about the other person, and really do think that there's an eternity at stake.
Hmm.
We have to be very careful that in the way we present that, we aren't so fervently going after them that we try to force them into something or make them feel like they have to do that. Or ultimately, we can't be the one that's going to decide for them. And the Bible makes it very clear that it's the Holy Spirit that's going to soften that person's heart and bring them to a point where they can make that decision and become convinced of it. And
Hmm.
so, as I've heard Dallas Jenkins say several times, we're in charge of bringing the fish and the loaves, not feeding the 5,000. So it's not my job to come and try to save Scott Williamson. It's my job to present what I believe that I think is a pathway to being saved, and give you a reason to think about it. And then you go think about it. And as you talk it over in your head, and hopefully, if you think, well, maybe if that possibility does exist, God, will you be a part of this? If you're there,
Hmm.
I want to invite you to be a part of this, even though I don't believe you're there right now. If you are there, please be a part of this, because I want you to convince me otherwise.
Yes. And why
Then
would I not want
why
that?
would you not
Like,
want that?
why would
Because we're all
anyone
searching for truth.
why would somebody not look? If God is real and this God is real or that God is real or whatever, I want to know what that truth is.
I
It
bet.
doesn't do me any favors to be so hard against things. And the other
I
thing
agree.
too, like you said, being conversational and understanding and being that way. I understand people come from a good place. So, when a lot of Christians or whoever family members will tell me, I'm going to pray for you. I know a lot of atheists, a lot of unbelievers get sort of irritated. I don't, because I understand they're coming from a good place. And I
Yeah.
always take people from the place that they're coming from, and I'll
Yeah.
even agree to the language with them if it helps them, because I truly am I'm more impressed by what people actually do for one another and
Yes.
where they're coming from as human beings. Forget about the beliefs. Let's talk about how, what are we doing for another human being that's a good thing.
Yeah.
Anyways, I think you're a good person,
That's
Greg. I
great.
think you're
I
very
think you are too.
yeah, and thank you. And I believe that you're sincere and you're honest, and you admit to a lot of things that a lot of Christians would call heresy. You don't care because you're on that journey, man, and you're there to talk about it, and I appreciate it. And look, we've been on for an hour and a half. I want to
Yeah. I
respect
appreciate
your
the time.
time. Yeah, I want to respect
Yeah.
that.
I want
And
to respect yours too.
thank you so much for coming on, man. And
I
again, if you
appreciate it.
guys like my channel, like, subscribe, who knows, it may turn into something if I keep having great guests like Greg to come on.
That's great. I appreciate it. Thank you so
Yes,
much.
sir. Yeah,
Blessings to
man.
you. Yeah.
You got it,
And your
man. Thank
family
you
and
so
all that.
much, brother.
Okay. Take care.
Have a good one.
You
Mhm.
too. Bye bye.